3 horrifying, someone's outside stories that are true. Story 1. The Watcher in the Woods. The scratching started at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. I remember the exact time because I was editing a client's wedding photos, and the timestamp on my computer screen burned into my memory the moment that sound pierced through the silence of my isolated cabin. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a freelance photographer who made the mistake of thinking that absolute solitude would cure my creative block. After a messy divorce and losing my studio lease in downtown Portland, I'd rented this remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains for what was supposed to be a peaceful 3-month retreat. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and cell service was practically non-existent. Perfect for focusing on work, I'd thought. The cabin sat on 40 acres of dense Douglas fir forest, connected to civilization by a single winding dirt road that became treacherous in bad weather. The landlord, an elderly man named Bill Hartman, had warned me about the isolation when I'd signed the lease. "Gets real quiet up there," he'd said, his weathered hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "Some folks can't handle that kind of quiet." I'd assured him I was looking forward to it. For the first 3 weeks, it had been exactly what I needed. I'd fallen into a routine: coffee at sunrise, hiking with my camera during the golden hours, editing in the afternoons, and reading by the fireplace in the evenings. The silence was therapeutic, broken only by the occasional owl or the distant howl of coyotes. I'd started sleeping better than I had in years, but that Tuesday night everything changed. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. Came from somewhere outside, near the front of the cabin. I paused my editing, thinking maybe a raccoon was trying to get into the trash cans I'd secured under the porch. The scratching stopped. I waited, listening to the silence stretch out like a held breath. Then it started again, but this time it moved. The sound traveled slowly along the front wall of the cabin, past the living room window, stopping just outside my bedroom. My skin prickled. Raccoons don't move that deliberately. This sounded almost methodical. I crept to the bedroom window and carefully pulled back a corner of the curtain. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows between the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The scratching had stopped again. I stood there for several minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, but heard nothing more. Telling myself I was being paranoid, I returned to my computer, but I couldn't concentrate. Every small sound, the settling of the cabin, the whisper of wind through the trees, made me jump. At 1 a.m., I finally gave up and went to bed, though sleep came fitfully. The next morning, I found them, gouges in the wood siding, running in parallel lines about 6 feet off the ground. They started near the front corner of the cabin and traced a path along the wall, stopping directly below my bedroom window. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale. But here's what made my blood run cold. They weren't random scratches. They formed letters. WTCHENG. Someone had carved WTCHENG into the side of my cabin. I immediately called Bill Hartman, but the call went straight to voicemail. The old landline in the cabin was dead, probably the phone company cutting service early for the winter, as they sometimes did with remote locations. I'd have to drive into town to report this, but my car was making that grinding noise again, and the last thing I wanted was to break down on that isolated mountain road. Instead, I spent the day installing additional locks on the doors and checking every window latch. I found my grandfather's old baseball bat in the closet and kept it close. The rational part of my mind insisted this was probably just local teenagers playing pranks, but the primal part of my brain was screaming that something was very wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every sound from outside sent adrenaline coursing through my system. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway, slow, measured steps circling the cabin. I grabbed the bat and my phone's flashlight, creeping from window to window, but the footsteps always seemed to be just out of sight, always one window ahead of me. The third night, I saw him. I'd been lying in bed, wide awake, when movement outside the bedroom window caught my eye. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, tall, unnaturally thin, moving with an odd, lurching gait. As it stepped into the moonlight, I could see it was wearing dark clothing and what looked like a hood or hat pulled low over its face. The figure stopped about 20 feet from the cabin and just stood there, facing my window. Even though I couldn't see its features, I could feel its attention like a physical weight. It stood motionless for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, without warning, it raised one arm and pointed directly at my window, at me. I ducked below the sill, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. The next morning, I found more messages carved into the trees around the cabin, soon scratched into the bark of the big pine near the front door. Inside, gouged into the oak by the bedroom window, and on the back door itself, carved so deep the letters went through the paint to the wood beneath. Tonight, that's when I broke. I threw my essential belongings into my car and tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, like someone had tampered with it. I popped the hood with shaking hands and immediately saw the problem: spark plug wires pulled loose, scattered around the engine compartment. I was trapped. As darkness fell, I barricaded myself in the bathroom, the only room without windows. I sat in the bathtub with the baseball bat across my knees, my phone flashlight creating a small circle of light in the darkness. The battery was at 12%. The scratching started again at 11:47 p.m., exactly 72 hours after it had begun. But this time it wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound came from the living room, then moved toward the kitchen. Slow, deliberate scratches against the interior walls. I heard furniture being moved, the squeak of floorboards under heavy footsteps. Whatever was in my cabin was taking its time, exploring, getting familiar with the space. The footsteps approached the bathroom door. I held my breath as the doorknob slowly turned. The door was locked, but the old mechanisms weren't meant for security. I heard something metal scraping against the lock mechanism, and then a soft click. The door swung open. The beam of my dying phone flashlight illuminated a pair of dirty boots, then traveled upward to reveal torn jeans, a dark jacket, and finally, nothing. Where the face should have been was just shadow beneath a deep hood, but I could hear breathing. Raspy, labored breathing that seemed to echo from somewhere deep and hollow. "Found you," a voice whispered, dry as autumn leaves. I swung the bat with everything I had, but it passed right through empty air. The figure had vanished, leaving only the smell of damp earth and decay. My phone died, plunging the bathroom into absolute darkness. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have flashes running through the dark cabin, crashing into furniture, the front door standing wide open, stumbling through the forest in my bare feet. I ran until I collapsed from exhaustion somewhere deep in the woods. I was found the next afternoon by a search and rescue team. Apparently, Bill Hartman had tried to call me about some paperwork, and when he couldn't reach me, had driven up to check on the cabin. He'd found my car with the hood up and spark plug wires scattered around and my belongings strewn across the front yard. The cabin itself was empty, but they found more messages. Hundreds of them carved into every available surface, the walls, the furniture, the floors. All the same words repeated over and over, 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒗𝒆. Soon, inside. Tonight, the police investigated, of course, but found no evidence of an intruder. No fingerprints, no DNA, no footprints in the soft earth around the cabin except mine. The official report listed it as a probable mental breakdown brought on by isolation. They suggested I seek counseling, but I know what I experienced. And 6 months later, when I was finally starting to feel safe again in my new apartment in the city, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of me sleeping in my new bed, taken from outside my 4th-floor window. On the back, in scratchy handwriting, were 4 words, still 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒗𝒆, still waiting. I moved again the next day. And the day after that, I found the same photograph slipped under my door. Some nights, I still hear the scratching. Story 2. The knock at 3 a.m. I should have trusted my instincts the moment I saw the house listing. The price was too good to be true. A fully furnished Victorian home in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Salem, Massachusetts, available for a 6-month rental at half the market rate. But I was desperate, having just started my residency at Salem Hospital, and my student loan payments were crushing me. I convinced myself the low rent was just because it was winter, and tourists avoided Salem in the off-season. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm a second-year psychiatric resident. I'd chosen Salem Hospital specifically because of their excellent mental health program, never imagining that the irony of a psychiatrist losing his mind would become so literal. I should have listened to my patients when they warned me about the things that hide in plain sight, about the difference between delusion and genuine terror. The house sat at the end of Chestnut Street, an imposing three-story structure with gabled windows and intricate woodwork that had been lovingly maintained despite being built in 1847. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the elderly owner, had seemed eager to rent it out when I'd called about the listing. "Just need someone to keep the place lived in during the winter months," she'd explained over the phone, her voice carrying a slight tremor that I'd attributed to age. "The house doesn't like being empty." I'd thought that was an odd way to phrase it, but landlords could be eccentric, especially in Salem where everything was marketed with supernatural overtones for the tourists. The first month was perfect. The house was beautifully appointed with antique furniture and modern amenities discreetly integrated. My bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the small garden and the neighboring houses. The third floor had been converted into a study with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with medical texts, classic literature, and what appeared to be historical documents about Salem's past. I spent many evenings up there, reading by the fireplace after long shifts at the hospital. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with young professionals and retirees who minded their own business. I'd introduced myself to the immediate neighbors, the Hendersons to the left, an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years, and the Martinez family to the right, with 2 young children who played in their backyard most afternoons. Everything changed on February 14th, Valentine's Day. I remember because I'd been working a brutal 36-hour shift in the emergency psychiatric unit, dealing with a string of crisis interventions that had left me emotionally drained. I'd gotten home around 2 a.m., exhausted and looking forward to collapsing into bed. I'd just fallen into a deep sleep when the knocking started. Knock, 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 3 measured raps on the front door. I groggily checked my phone. 3:17 a.m. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? My first thought was that there might be an emergency with one of the neighbors, or perhaps someone having a mental health crisis had followed me home from the hospital. It happened more often than people realized. I pulled on a robe and made my way downstairs, turning on lights as I went. The knocking had stopped, but I could see a shadow through the frosted glass panels beside the front door. Someone was definitely standing on the porch. "Who is it?" I called out, but received no response. I looked through the peephole, but the porch light was off and I couldn't make out any details of whoever was standing there. Just a dark silhouette, motionless. "Can I help you?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Every instinct told me not to open that door. I was trained to recognize potentially dangerous situations, and this had all the hallmarks of one. Instead, I went to the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain to get a better view of the porch. The figure was gone. I waited by the window for several minutes, scanning the street and neighboring yards, but saw nothing. No car driving away, no footsteps, no movement at all. It was as if whoever had been there had simply vanished. Unsettled but exhausted, I double-checked all the locks and returned to bed. I'd almost convinced myself it had been a confused drunk or someone playing a prank when the knocking started again. Knock, 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 same rhythm, same volume. 3:33 a.m. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while moving to the window. The dispatcher was professional but seemed skeptical when I explained the situation. "We'll send a unit to patrol the area, sir, but if no one's there when they arrive." I understood. Cops had better things to do than chase shadows. I watched from the window as the police cruiser slowly drove down Chestnut Street. About 10 minutes later, its spotlight sweeping across front yards and porches. It paused briefly in front of my house, then continued on. No one had knocked since I'd made the call. The officer called me back 20 minutes later. "Didn't see anyone in the area, Mr. Webb. Could have been kids or maybe someone having car trouble who moved on. "We'll increase patrols tonight, but call back if you see anything specific." I thanked him and tried to go back to sleep, but I was too wired. I made coffee and sat in the kitchen, watching the street through the window until dawn. Nothing. The next night I was ready. I'd installed a small security camera above the front door, the kind designed for package deliveries, with night vision and motion detection. I also moved a chair to the front window where I could watch the porch directly. At 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera. I looked at the live feed and felt my blood turn to ice. A woman stood on my porch, facing the door. She was wearing a long, white dress that seemed to glow in the infrared camera, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. But here's what made my professional training kick into overdrive: she wasn't moving at all. No swaying, no breathing, no shifting of weight. She stood like a statue, perfectly still. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front door, but on the camera, the woman's hands remained at her sides. She wasn't knocking. I grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Blackwood, knowing it was the middle of the night but desperate for answers. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been expecting my call. "She's back, isn't she?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was steady, resigned. "Who's back?" "Mrs. Blackwood, there's a woman on my porch, and I think she might be having some kind of episode." "Her name was Margaret Corey," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted. "She lived in that house from 1923 until 1956. Murdered her husband on Valentine's Day after finding out about his affair. She used a kitchen knife, stabbed him 17 times while he slept. Then she walked out onto the front porch and, well, she hanged herself from the oak tree that used to stand in the front yard." My mouth went dry. "Mrs. Blackwood, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Margaret never left, Dr. Webb. She knocks every February 14th and every night thereafter until someone acknowledges her. The last tenant made the mistake of opening the door. What happened to him?" "The line was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. They found him 3 days later sitting in his kitchen. 17 stab wounds just like her husband. The knife was from his own kitchen and his fingerprints were the only ones on it. Coroner ruled it a suicide, though how someone stabs themselves 17 times." She trailed off. Knock, knock, knock. The woman on my porch still hadn't moved, but the knocking continued. "What do I do?" I whispered into the phone. "Don't open the door, don't acknowledge her, don't look directly at her. She feeds on attention, on recognition. The more you engage, the stronger she becomes." I ended the call and forced myself to look away from both the window and the camera feed. But the knocking continued, growing more insistent. 3 knocks became 6, then 9, then a continuous hammering that seemed to shake the entire house. For 3 hours, I sat in my kitchen with my back to the front of the house, hands pressed over my ears, trying to drown out the sound. My medical training kept telling me this was impossible, that I was having some kind of psychological break brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But the knocking was real. The camera was real. The sound of wood splintering under repeated impacts was definitely real. At dawn, it stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to look. The porch was empty, but the front door was covered in deep gouges, as if someone had been clawing at it with their bare hands. The camera showed the woman appearing at 3:17 a.m. and vanishing at 6:33 a.m., standing motionless the entire time while the sound of knocking continued. I packed my things that morning and checked into a hotel. When I called Mrs. Blackwood to break the lease, she was surprisingly understanding. "I should have warned you more directly," she admitted. "People never believe until they experience it themselves. The house has been in my family for generations. Margaret is part of it now. Some years she's quiet, other years she's more active. This was apparently an active year. Why don't you just sell the house or have it, I don't know, exorcised?" Mrs. Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "We've tried everything, Dr. Webb. Priests, mediums, historians, paranormal investigators. Nothing works. Margaret isn't haunting the house, she is the house now. And she only gets angry when people try to remove her." I never went back to Chestnut Street, but I still follow the local news. 6 months after I left, another tenant rented the house, a young teacher named Jennifer Walsh. She lasted 2 weeks. They found her on February 28th, sitting at her kitchen table with 17 stab wounds. The knife was from her own kitchen, her fingerprints the only ones on it. Another suicide according to the coroner, but I know better. Sometimes, late at night when I'm on call at the hospital, I think I can hear it, that measured, insistent knocking echoing through the empty corridors. And I know that someday Margaret Corey will knock on my door again. Because once she's noticed you, she never really lets you go. Story 3. The man who wasn't there. The power went out during the worst blizzard in 20 years, and that's when I first saw him, the man standing in my backyard who shouldn't have been able to exist. I'm Detective Rachel Torres, 15 years with the Chicago PD, specializing in missing persons cases. I've seen enough of humanity's dark side to know that monsters are real, but they usually wear human faces and have explicable motives. I've never believed in ghosts, demons, or things that go bump in the night. My job requires facts, evidence, logical explanations. But what happened during those 3 days in January challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. It started when I decided to take my first vacation in 2 years. My captain had practically forced me to use up accumulated time off, threatening to dock my pay if I didn't. I'd rented a small cabin in Wisconsin, about 3 hours north of Chicago, nestled among towering pines on the shore of a frozen lake. The plan was simple: read, sleep, maybe do some ice fishing, and forget about the stack of cold cases sitting on my desk. The cabin belonged to my Uncle Ray, a retired state trooper who'd bought it as a retirement project. It was perfectly isolated. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the access road was a narrow track that became impassable in heavy snow. Ray had warned me about the weather forecast, but I'd driven through blizzards before. I thought I could handle it. The storm hit on my second night there, February 3rd. What had been predicted as light snow turned into a full-scale blizzard, with winds that howled like banshees and snow falling so thick I couldn't see the lake from the front windows. By midnight, the power lines couldn't handle the weight of ice and snow. The lights flickered twice, then died completely. I'd been smart enough to bring battery-powered lanterns and a good supply of food, so I wasn't worried about the essentials. The cabin had a wood-burning stove that kept the main room comfortable, and I'd settled in with a paperback thriller and a glass of wine, actually enjoying the forced disconnection from the world. That's when I saw the footprints. I'd gotten up to add another log to the fire when movement outside caught my eye. Using my phone's flashlight, I looked through the back window toward the lake and saw them clearly in the pristine snow. A line of human footprints leading from the tree line to a spot about 30 feet from the cabin, where they simply stopped, not turned around, not led anywhere else. They just ended. I grabbed my service weapon and a high-powered flashlight, pulling on my boots and coat. As a cop, my first thought was that someone might be in trouble, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost in the storm. The temperature was dropping fast, and exposure was a real danger. But when I opened the back door, the wind nearly knocked me over. The snow was falling so hard that my flashlight beam only penetrated a few feet. I could barely make out the nearest trees, let alone see the end of those footprints. And here's what really bothered me. In the time it had taken me to get dressed and grab my gear, maybe 3 minutes, there should have been at least another inch of snow filling in those tracks. But they looked as fresh as when I'd first spotted them. I followed the footprints, fighting against the wind and snow. They were definitely human, I'd guess size 11 or 12 boots, with a distinctive tread pattern that suggested work boots or hiking boots. The stride length indicated someone tall, probably male, but the depth of the impressions was wrong. In snow this soft, someone walking should have sunk in at least 4 or 5 inches. These prints were barely 2 inches deep, as if whoever made them weighed almost nothing. When I reached the spot where the tracks ended, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the snow, clear as day, was the impression of a human body. Not like someone had fallen, like someone had been lying there, arms at their sides, legs straight. The impression was perfect, detailed enough that I could see the outline of buttons on a coat, the pattern of fabric, but there was no one there. I called out, sweeping my flashlight in all directions. "Police! If someone's out here, respond." My voice was swallowed by the wind, and I heard nothing back except the storm. I stayed out there for 20 minutes, searching in an expanding circle around the body impression, but found nothing. No other tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where whoever had made this mark could have gone. When I finally returned to the cabin, I was soaked and half frozen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the door handle. I radioed dispatch on my portable radio, but the storm was interfering with transmission. I got through long enough to report a possible missing person and request a welfare check once the weather cleared, but the signal kept cutting out. I was on my own until the storm passed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair by the back window, my gun in my lap, watching those footprints and the body impression in the snow. They should have been filled in by morning, erased by the continuing snowfall. Instead, they remained perfectly preserved as if the snow was avoiding them. Around 4 a.m. I saw him. A man walked out of the tree line, following the exact path of the footprints I'd discovered earlier. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Even in the storm, even with snow swirling around him, his outline was perfectly clear and sharp. Too clear. The falling snow should have obscured him, made him hazy and indistinct, but he stood out like he was lit by invisible spotlights. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he reached the spot where the body impression was. Then he lay down, positioning himself exactly within the outline in the snow. He folded his hands across his chest and went completely still. I watched him for over an hour. He never moved, never shifted position, never seemed to breathe. The snow continued to fall around him, but none of it landed on him. It was like he existed in a bubble of calm air while the storm raged everywhere else. At dawn, he simply wasn't there anymore. One moment I was looking at him, and the next, the space was empty. But the body impression remained, and now there were new details I hadn't noticed before. The outline of a face in the snow, features clearly defined. A man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, his mouth open as if he were screaming. I spent that day researching the property's history on my phone, using what little battery I had left. What I found made my hands shake worse than the cold had. In 1987, a man named David Kellerman had rented this same cabin for a winter fishing trip. He'd been reported missing when he failed to return to work after his vacation. Search teams had found his car in the cabin's driveway, but David himself was never located. The official theory was that he'd fallen through thin ice while fishing and his body had been swept away by currents under the frozen lake. But according to the police reports I managed to access, there had been something strange about the scene. Search teams had found a perfect outline of a human body in the snow behind the cabin, as if someone had been lying there. But there were no footprints leading to or from the impression, and the snow around it was undisturbed. The investigating officers had noted it in their reports but couldn't explain it. David Kellerman had never been found. That second night he appeared again. Same time, same path, same routine. But this time when he lay down in the snow, he turned his head and looked directly at me through the window. Even from 30 feet away, even through the glass in the storm, I could see his eyes. They were black holes in his face, empty spaces where eyes should have been. He mouthed something at me, and even though I couldn't hear him, I understood what he was saying. Help me. I should have stayed inside. Every instinct I'd developed as a cop was screaming at me to remain safe, to wait for backup, to approach this rationally. But David Kellerman had been missing for 37 years, and if there was even a chance he was somehow still alive, still calling for help, I went outside. The moment I stepped into the storm, everything changed. The wind stopped howling. The snow hung motionless in the air, suspended like someone had paused a video. The temperature, which had been well below freezing, became comfortable, almost warm. And David Kellerman sat up in the snow and looked at me with those hollow, empty eye sockets. "You can see me," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the impossible stillness. "You're the first one who's been able to see me. What happened to you, David?" I kept my hand on my weapon but didn't draw it. Whatever this was, I didn't think bullets would help. "I died here," he said simply. "Heart attack while I was ice fishing. Fell through and the cold stopped my heart before I could get out, but I never left. I've been trying to get help, trying to get someone to find my body, but no one ever sees me, except you." "Why me?" He smiled, and it was the most horrible thing I'd ever seen. "Because you're going to join me." That's when I realized the truth. The storm hadn't stopped, I had. My heart had stopped. In the supernatural cold of his presence, my body had gone into cardiac arrest just like his had 37 years ago. I was dying and he was welcoming me to whatever limbo he'd been trapped in. But I'm a fighter, always have been. Instead of accepting death, I forced myself to move, to feel the cold, to make my heart beat through sheer will and stubbornness. I stumbled backward toward the cabin, feeling sensation slowly returning to my limbs as I got further from David. "You can't leave," he called after me, his voice becoming distorted and human. "I've been alone for so long, please don't leave me alone." I made it to the cabin and slammed the door, my heart hammering irregularly in my chest. Through the window, I watched David stand up and walk back into the trees, but this time he didn't disappear. He stood at the edge of the forest, watching the cabin, waiting. He's still there. The storm ended the next morning and the road crews got through by afternoon. I left immediately, not even staying to pack properly. But I kept my promise to David in a way. I filed a report about the possible location of his remains, and a dive team recovered his body from the lake bottom 3 months later. He'd been trapped under a fallen tree, preserved by the cold water, still wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in. They gave him a proper burial, and I thought that would be the end of it. But David had been right about one thing: I died for just a moment in that snow, and something had changed. Now I see them everywhere. The dead who haven't moved on, the spirits trapped between worlds, the people who died alone and forgotten. They recognize me as someone who's crossed over and come back, and they all want the same thing David wanted: someone to see them, to acknowledge their existence, to help them find peace. My missing persons cases have a much higher solve rate now, but the price of that success is that I'm never really alone anymore. There's always someone standing just at the edge of my vision, waiting for help I'm not sure I can give. Sometimes I wonder if I really made it back from that snowy limbo, or if I'm still lying in the snow behind a cabin in Wisconsin, dreaming that I survived. The worst part is, I'm not sure I want to know the answer.